The whole world will know her by her real name. Queen of the Ring was written and directed by Ash Avildsen, who's done films like What Now and American Satan, and is based on the book Queen of the Ring by Jeff. Lean on me when you're not strong. Watch Mildred Burke carry women's wrestling on her broad shoulders, and she will make sure to bring women's wrestling up to the promised land. Yes, Queen of the Ring has been a long time coming, to the point that Jim Ross actually had an option on this film many, many years ago. And after the popular book hit shelves and the success of The Iron Claw by A24 showed that, there actually is an audience for wrestling movies, wrestling biopics, stories about professional wrestling from a long time ago. The Iron Claw came out in late 2023 and was set in the 1980s. Well, Queen of the Ring is set all the way back in the 30s, the 40s, and even the 50s. It covers a lot of goddamn ground and centers around Mildred Burke, widely regarded as the first million-dollar female athlete in history. So, who is Mildred Burke, you may be asking? Well, sit down, shut the fuck up, and I'll be happy to tell you who the fuck Mildred Burke was. Besides what I just mentioned, she basically is pretty much the big pioneer of women's professional wrestling. There's, a lot of stuff to dive into when it comes to her story. She was born in 1915. She lived all the way to 1989, and for a number of years was seen as the women's wrestler. And yes, there were many great talents, some that I'll talk about in this review as I go on. But Mildred Burke was so famous and so beloved. Just the problem is because of the period, there was a point where she was going to come to a crossroads in her career and in her personal life. I'm keeping this as spoiler-free as possible, but those that are wrestling fans that have dived into the history of Mildred Burke and women's wrestling in general, you already know what the story pretty much is. I will say that because of the PG-13 rating, this doesn't get into a lot of the seedier stuff and the really, really dark stuff that took place in her life. That's something that you could check the book out for. This doesn't cover all the book. But I will say, as far as the look, the presentation, and the love and care that Ash had, along with his crew and Sumerian Pictures Films, whatever the fuck they're called, they obviously wanted to take love and care to present wrestling as a period piece, as a melodrama, as something that was inspirational, because Mildred was also a single mother and was doing this while raising her child and was bound and determined to be arguably the greatest of all time, at least the most influential of her time. And considering the name Mildred Burke is still on the tips of many wrestling fans and wrestling historians' tongues when women's wrestling is mentioned, forget your Fabulous Moolahs, because nobody really wants to mention that goddamn haggard bitch, and fuck Fabulous Moolah, I'm glad she's dead. But this film has been a long time in the making, and I was actually bound and determined to see this as soon as possible, and was ready to drive an hour north just to see it as early as possible, because I was the only theater at the time that was playing it. Fortunately, the theater in town got showings for it, and I didn't have to drive so far. Hooray for not traveling in Washington State traffic, because it's bullshit. Anyway, enough about Washington State, because nobody cares about that. Let's talk about Mildred Burke. I will say that Emily Bett Rickards does a great job encapsulating Mildred's fighting spirit. And while, yes, none of the people look like the ones that, they're portraying, I will say that enough of the people that are featured do a good enough job trying to capture the spirit of professional wrestling. That is where the movie's strength really is when we see the wrestling scenes, and I do have to mention there are some contemporary wrestlers that play older versions of, or play older wrestlers, and I will say that they were the ones that were taking the most bumps, including Camille, who has wrestled in the NWA, wrestled in AEW for a cup of coffee. She plays June Byers. June Byers is another major name in professional wrestling. And a lot of this centers around Mildred's on-again, off-again relationship with Billy Wolf, played by Josh Lucas. I do have to say Josh Lucas does capture Billy's flaws, shall we say. I think Josh Lucas, or as many called him, myself included, Matthew McConnell Lucas, He actually does a good job as Billy Wolf. And Tyler Posey plays Billy's son, G. Bill. And there are various other, pieces of wrestling history, promoters, and other wrestlers that are featured in this. So, with that being said, I'll talk about that as things go on. How does this film measure up as far as, a timeline of events and everything and presenting Mildred Burke's story? When it's focused on the ring and when it just focuses on, on the bumps and the pain, blues, and agony that Emily is willing to take, and, having that fighting spirit and that determination, there are some scenes in this that do pop. There are some scenes in this that aren't that bad. There were scenes in the Iron Claw that worked pretty goddamn well. And yes, it does show that women had to really fight and claw and scratch, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s. I mean, even in the 60s and 70s, if we're being perfectly honest, you can go back and look at a lot of those wrestling cards all over the country. There were so many, times where women were either left off the cards or they were in the opening or, like the second or third match. And Mildred Burke was able to main event cards through hard work, determination, and also thanks to the promotion of Billy Wolf. And even after certain things happened, Mildred was able to do things to try to bring women's wrestling to prominence. I'm not saying that Mildred was an absolute saint. There are stories out about her and how she helped train women and everything, and some did well, some didn't do very well. That is also down to how women's wrestling was perceived and maybe Mildred's reputation once, she was basically out of active wrestling, because by the mid-50s or whatever, things had really taken a turn for the worse. The worm had turned, as many people say. So now I want to talk about the stuff I didn't like about this. This has some of the worst, most insipid, and AI-inspired wrestling dialogue that I have heard in a movie since The Iron Claw. I'm not saying, by the way, that people didn't talk certain ways, and I've never been in wrestling. I've been backstage at one independent wrestling show. I know more about the Iron Claw story, the Von Erichs, than I know about Mildred Burke. But I know this much. I know that there were many moments in this where I'm like, well, that just doesn't seem legit. That seems very melodramatic, and that seems kind of silly. And the music choices at times worked. There were some old spins on contemporary songs. At least contemporary for me, because they were around during my lifetime. And yes, there are some cool vintage cars, some cool vintage costumes. And I do want to say I did pop for certain, wrestling personalities showing up. James E. Cornette, who was an NWA official, or the NWA spokesperson, shall we say. And I do want to say before I continue on with this review, yes, I love Jim Cornette's drive-through and experience. Him and the great Brian Last. I'm not saying I always agree with every single thing that those guys say, but I find it entertaining. I find it witty. I appreciate the wrestling analysis breakdown, scathing reviews, whatever you say, however you want to label it. And he talked about this with Ash in a 2-part interview that was done on some of the most recent shows. I do have to say Ash does come across as a passionate wrestling fan, and he wanted to do good with this film. And I believe that he does come from a love and appreciation for professional wrestling, showing it as an art, showing it as pain, broken bones, and all that stuff and everything. And he has talent as a filmmaker, and there are moments in this film that do shine. It's just the problem is, at 2 hours and 10 minutes, there's too much fluff in this, and not enough focus on, not enough focus on the wrestling, in my personal opinion. I'm not saying that I wanted, like nothing, like 90% in-ring action, but this was almost WWE-like with the amount of talking that we got. They were trying to talk us into the building. Yeah, there were points where I was like, okay, there were scenes that worked, and then there were other scenes where I was like, all right, yeah, they did show a few of the darker things. They couldn't show everything, though, or otherwise this thing really would have had to have been rated R, almost NC-17. I'm not fucking kidding with some of the stuff I'm talking about. And Toni Storm played Clara Mortensen, Naomi, or Trinity Fatu. She plays Ethel Johnson. Clara Mortensen, by the way, very famous women's wrestler. Ethel Johnson as well. Britt Baker was Debbie Nichols, and Ash even played Vince McMahon Sr. Now, I'm far enough in the review where I feel I can. This stuff's all in the cast, by the way. You can just look at it. Camilda's great as June Byers, though. I mean, just fucking tremendous. Elvira Snodgrass was played by Maria Argyropoulos. I hope I got that right. I do have to say she has pop to her. I'd like to see what else she can do. Walton Goggins plays Jack Pfeffer. Jack Pfeffer could be a whole movie on his own. The amount of shit that he did, the amount of history that he, the amount of wrestling history that he had a hand in. I mean, he also was a promoter that was not very well respected because he exposed the business that people wouldn't, book his talent. But nevertheless, this is about Mildred Burke. I'm getting sidetracked. This movie got sidetracked a whole lot, and it reminded me a lot of the Iron Claw, where it's like, oh, these people are interacting, and hey, this name and this name. It's snapshot storytelling. To the point that this film actually got frustrating, because I'm like, this isn't focusing enough on Mildred Burke. I mean, there were scenes that worked, like when she was doing her early training, and all the way up to a big title match, which bookends the movie, I just want to say. And it does tell enough of Mildred's story. If you don't know anything about it, you might find this inspiring, but to be perfectly honest, the dialogue and some of the line reading might undo any enthusiasm that you have for this particular project. And I have to say that I wanted to like this more than I did, and unfortunately, I ended up really liking this all that much, and I'm very disappointed by that. I actually, about an hour in, maybe not even that, maybe 45 minutes in, I'm like, there are parts of this that are all right, but this is starting to slip, and it kind of reminded me of The Fire Inside. It told a very glossy, very paper-thin story of, that boxer, played by Ryan Destiny, by the way, who I do have to say, her and Byron Tyree, they were great. They were great. But Ryan Destiny was tremendous in this. And Emily really does a great job as Mildred. Just the problem is, and yes, when they captured the look of a small arena and everything, and I swear that ring was like 8 feet by 8 feet. I mean, and again, budgetary constraints, but still, my God. And Camille did a lot of the wrestling stunt work, shall we say, because she's an experienced worker. Toni obviously did her own stuff. Toni Storm did. We didn't get to see Naomi really get in the ring, and I'm sure a lot of stuff was cut in this, but there were points where I was like, okay, this film is stumbling, and it's pretty much just shattered both its ankles, like it's Kerry Von Erich, even though he only shattered one ankle and lost one of his feet. But that being said, this film ends up stumbling, not out of the gate, but by the second act, it was really starting to have issues. And even when it tries to kick things in to gear in the third act, by then the battle is lost. The battle is totally lost, and they did basically limp to their goddamn conclusion. So yeah, that's really all I have to say without getting into some spoilers, which I'm not going to say are going to take totally long, because again, it's better to read the book, find out about some stuff, but I liked some of it, but I didn't like enough of it to say this is really great. But that being said, go see it. Support films like this. Maybe you'll feel differently. The Iron Claw was a hit. I'd like to see more films like this get made. As far as telling stories, like maybe tell a story about Randy Savage, maybe tell a story about Ric Flair, even though I don't think they really could do that without making that NC-17. But they could tell stories about, like, other women's wrestlers, and they could expand and make this a giant universe. This just didn't do Mildred Burke's life and career justice, in my opinion. Anyway, 3, 2, 1, and spoilers. So, basically, we start off with her against June Byers on August 20th in 1954. And some of this was shot in Louisville, Kentucky, by the way. So, Jim Cornette was able to be there because he lives in Louisville, Kentucky. He doesn't like to travel all that much after traveling for decades, and I don't blame him. And he actually has some pretty good scenes. I did pop, admittedly. I mean, like I said, I'm a fan of his. And I popped when I saw Toni Storm. Toni Storm looking as only she can look. And Naomi, I thought, could have done so much more as Ethel Johnson. Babs Wingo, that was a good reference as well. There were many, many great references in this. Gladys Gillam And boy, you want to read up something tragic, read up about her. And just various others. I do want to shout Francesca Eastwood, who plays Mae Young. One, Francesca looks great. Two, she captures enough of the angry, don't take any shit attitude of Mae Young. Even though Mae had her peculiarities as well, Mae Young was considered to be one of the pioneers of women's wrestling. Josh Lucas does a great job as Billy Wolf, but I'm going to say as far as the seedier stuff, there was a lot of abuse by not just Billy, but also by his son. That's alleged. That's stuff that's out there and everything. So, there's grains of truth in that, and the stuff Mildred had to go through, basically being a woman, building this empire, but she needed Billy's help because he's a man, she's a woman, and sexism and all that. That issue isn't dived into enough, by the way. And there are some scenes of abuse, PG-13 wise. If that triggers anything with you, that's your fair warning. You can see them coming a mile away. She also has the son, Joe, who does eventually grow up, as kids mostly do, unless you're Jack Atkinson Jr. I'm so sorry. So sorry. But we start with the title match, and then we show, her flex. Again, Emily put in the work and had a great look as far as looking like Mildred Burke, looking like a strong woman of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Looked great. She broke into wrestling in 1935. Mildred did, not Emily. That would be very confusing. And had to train on the carnival circuit and basically saw Billy Wolf wrestling. I don't remember who they said he was wrestling. The name just skipped by me. But Billy Wolf was a wrestler and wanted to get into promoting and everything, and basically was a pioneer promoter as far as having women's wrestling taken seriously. The thing is, Billy also, in addition to getting with Mildred, also was a serial cheater. Cheating and sleeping with a lot of the women, the up-and-coming women, stuff like that. And there are, there's insinuations and innuendos and innuendos and all that stuff. And this frustrates Mildred. And there are times where she wants to leave, she wants to go back, and she wants to do stuff. She wants to go out on her own, especially after building her own goddamn thing. There is a point where she wrestles June Byers after wrestling some men on, in the traveling circuit, everything, the traveling freak show, carnival, whatever you want to call it. And June Byers shows up, and, Camille, again, very statuesque, really does actually a pretty good job here. And Mildred and her have a match, and Mildred gets all not hoity-toity, but gets egotistical, thinking it's a work. Well, June doesn't really play nice and kicks her in the knee, and that trick knee is something that ends up haunting Mildred for the rest of this whole thing. Billy is still wrestling, doing bookings, and then basically decides to step out of the ring to continue this promoting. And him and Mildred do end up getting married eventually, even though he, at one point, ends up hitting her. She leaves. She's trying to get her own bookings. Jack Pfeffer, by the way, there's no way they could have done Jack Pfeffer's accent, so it's a good thing they left that to the side. They did talk about promoter Al Haft, not Hafty. Why would you say it like that? And also, they kept referencing the NWA. The NWA wouldn't allow women's wrestling and all that stuff. Lou Thez and Gorgeous George at one point were shown. And Gorgeous George, I do have to say, he is played by Adam Demos, who does an okay job. It's more about Mildred Burke, but nevertheless, they have a working relationship, I guess. It's never explored enough to where you really care. But anyway, I popped when I saw something later on about Lou Thez on the marquee. Lou Thez didn't want to work with on the card with midgets or women. He wanted to be taken totally seriously. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. That's what Lou Thez thought. And basically, Mildred had to fight and scratch and claw, get other women booked and stuff like that. She wanted to divorce Billy, but she ended up winning the title in a shoot with Clara Mortensen. I'd say Toni Storm did a really good job here with that, and they did something where she beat her, won the title, the Burke, as the current NWA calls it, for what's left of the NWA, thanks to William Patrick Corgan, pretty much torpedoing and torching and burning everything to the ground. But basically, she holds the title. She is very, very happy to hold the championship, and there's talk where she is going to have a lot of, basically women, working for her and everything, and working with her. She's trying to book these women. Jack Pfeffer wants to promote women's wrestling in certain areas and wants to do well. Once Billy and her end up getting divorced, that is, she basically leaves him the entire empire, and it doesn't end up basically working out in her favor, even as she continues to carry on, is working, in front of smaller crowds, trying to build up the reputation, because people love Mildred Burke, so much so that there were little girls cheering on her on, and rah, 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 and all these women are with her. And then other women have to go with Billy Wolf because Billy is booking the women for better payoffs and everything. And even though they love Mildred, they have to go where the money is. I do have to say that there were just lines in this that just made me laugh. There was a point, and I'm probably going to close with this, because as we're building towards June Byers and Mildred Burke, there's also a subplot where Mildred and Billy's son, G-Bill, maybe you're going to get together. G-Bill wants to take care of her. The thing is there was a lot of abuse stuff between everybody. A lot of stuff going on with that. The son and the father, and not the Holy Spirit. Mildred suffered a lot. She couldn't do that. She ended up doing a divorce and all that. And then G-Bill ended up getting in an accident. Also, there was something about Joe. He wanted to work with Billy and had ideas on how to book things and stuff like that. And I'm pretty certain that that's not how any of this worked, but I don't know. Just something about this did not feel authentic at all. And then, basically, June Byers is brought to take care of G-Bill and nurse him back to health. There are worse ways to spend your life other than Camille nursing you to health. But this means that June Byers is basically propped up as Billy's new champion, new Hurricane Force. And it comes down to Mildred working with various people. Gladys ends up actually having, injuries, having a condition. She wrestles June. June tosses her over the top rope, and June ends up inadvertently causing her death. It was like a blood clot and like some issue with her stomach, shrieking David Von Erich noises, glug glug, I'm so sorry once again. And as we build up to Mildred versus June, we get, and this is where the movie absolutely fucking lost me. I mean, the movie had already lost me by this point, but I was still trying to hang with it. Build to this big title match that was hyped up like crazy. And Josh Lucas says, bad times don't last, dreams do come true. He basically quoted Scott Hall. He quoted Scott Hall from his Hall of Fame speech. That's what he did. I am so fucking irritated by that. I don't know why. I don't know why that irked me, but it did. Bad times don't last, but bad guys do. What? Why would you include that line? It was totally out of place also, and the fact that we knew that line... Yes, maybe this movie isn't made for goddamn wrestling fans and people that have studied wrestling, but good God. And I'm trying not to be angry. But anyway, they build up the big fight. Cornette has a line as the NWA spokesperson. And June's all beat up, can't continue. Mildred is finally fired up and everything, even with her trick knee, is fired back and beating up June. And, well, if June won't quit and, this match has a time limit and everything, Mildred ends up basically retaining the championship. And then we see a bunch of historical stuff about various people involved in the movie. And how Mildred basically died of a stroke, I believe, in 1989. And she had a lot of issues as far as trying to keep, staying relevant in wrestling and training women. They had to go over to Japan and stuff like that. And there's a lot to dive into it. This movie could have dived a little more into. And yeah, it might have been a little bit too busy, but there was too much melodrama, bad dialogue. I really wanted to like this more than I did. And unfortunately, Queen of the Ring ends up, I'm sorry, it gets a 2 out of 5 what I gave it on Letterboxd, which means it gets an F. And I'm sorry, I appreciate some of the technical stuff, but this wasn't good. This wasn't good, really, as honoring Mildred Burke's life. It was not inspirational. It honestly was pretty silly and goofy and melodramatic. And not melodramatic in a good way. Melodramatic in a cheesy way. Like, not cheesy where, oh, okay, this is stuff we've seen before, we can do this. Like, no. Didn't work for me, brother. Oh, yeah, by the way, Josh Lucas also said about, one promoter, oh, Claire is supposed to drop the title. Well, no, we're going to do this. Well, that doesn't work for me, Brutus. Okay, before I really get upset about the inaccuracies and other stuff like that, I'm just going to say, go watch it, give it a shot. Maybe you'll feel differently. I'm giving it an F. I'm sorry. Agree, disagree, what I said, like, share, subscribe, Twitter, Letterboxd, Blue Sky handles in the description. I'm John Rithlin, and I'll see you soon.